It was a strange period. I mean, I pulled a bit of a Ziggy Stardust moment where I wanted to quit music.
Maybe.
Maybe. You're being elusive?
I don't know.
How's his sense of...
In the 1990s, when rock seemed to be losing ground to sugary pop and hip-hop was beginning to dominate the radio, a figure emerged as if straight out of a collective nightmare. The name: Marilyn Manson. For many, he was just another rock singer trying to shock the public. For others, he represented something much bigger: the materialization of fear, rebellion, and taboo. Brian Hugh Warner, a young music journalist born in Ohio, reinvented himself by creating an alter ego that combined glamour and tragedy in a single name: Marilyn, from Marilyn Monroe, and Manson, from Charles Manson, the infamous cult leader responsible for brutal murders in the 1960s. The contrast in his artistic baptism said it all: beauty and violence, innocence and perversion, light and darkness. From his very first shows, Manson was not just a musician. He was an experience. The stage transformed into a chaotic ritual, where crucifixes were smashed, religious imagery was distorted, and the audience was drawn into a collective catharsis. His album Antichrist Superstar, 1996, solidified this aesthetic. Lyrics filled with hatred, nihilism, and religious provocation placed him at the center of worldwide controversy. Conservative America feared him. Religious leaders demanded the cancellation of his shows. Politicians pointed to him as the satanic influence corrupting the youth. And yet, precisely because of this, millions of young people saw in Manson a voice that echoed their anger, their sense of alienation, and their desire to defy a hypocritical system. But one question always lingered: where did the artistic performance end, and where did the dark truth begin? While newspapers accused him of being a prophet of the devil, Manson replied with sharp interviews, insisting that it was all part of a grand spectacle. He was the villain society needed to point fingers at. He was the distorted mirror of a culture hiding its own sins under the rug. Still, the line was thin. Some former band members and people close to him told disturbing stories. Private parties filled with excess, occult symbols scattered throughout his house, aggressive behavior off stage. It was as if the character had swallowed the man. At the height of his fame, Manson seemed untouchable. He graced magazine covers, released music videos banned from TV, and appeared in fiery speeches from politicians demanding censorship. He was at once public enemy number one and the secret idol of millions. But every icon built on shock and transgression carries an inevitable question. How much of it is performance? And how much is the revelation of a darker side the artist himself can no longer control? This doubt would linger for years. What once seemed like horror theater would start to blur with real allegations of abuse, psychological manipulation, and even ritualistic practices. The character, meant to be a mask, began to merge with the flesh and blood of Brian Warner. On stage, Marilyn Manson screamed to the crowds, "I am what you fear. I am what you created." And maybe, in some way, he was right. When the lights went out and Marilyn Manson appeared on stage, it wasn't just a rock show. It was a ceremony. The heavy chords, the images projected on giant screens, the inverted crosses, and the calculated gestures created an atmosphere that went far beyond simple entertainment. For his fans, it was liberating. For his critics, it was satanic. The stage turned into a profane temple. Manson wore outfits that blended elements of fetishism, military aesthetics, and religious symbolism. In some performances, he appeared dressed in a cassock. In others, he tore pages from the Bible in front of the audience. The spectacle wasn't just music. It was a ritualistic deconstruction of everything American society considered sacred. The question that always echoed was, where did performance end and reality begin? The aesthetic of the occult. Manson never hid his fascination with figures like Aleister Crowley, the British occultist who preached the maxim, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." In interviews, he referenced the Satanism of Anton LaVey, founder of the Church of Satan, who even named Manson an honorary priest within his institution. Was it merely a strategy to shock conservative American society? Or was there a deeper involvement? Critics argue it was nothing more than clever marketing. but behind-the-scenes accounts suggest that some rituals and symbols went beyond the stage. Black candles, makeshift altars, and private ceremonies at exclusive parties fueled the rumors. The limit of shock. The persona of the Antichrist Superstar seemed to know no boundaries. Manson would climb onto mock pulpits, as if preaching to an inverted congregation, mocking Christian liturgy. During shows, he simulated crucifixions and staged performances reminiscent of black masses. For fans, this was liberation, a visual metaphor against the dogmas that suffocated generations. But for many critics, the line had been crossed. Pastors and politicians accused the singer of recruiting young people into devil worship. Whether this was an exaggeration or not hardly mattered. The impact was already made. The persona consuming the man. Perhaps the most disturbing element was the sense that Brian Warner had disappeared beneath the mask of Marilyn Manson. The ordinary, shy, introspective man seemed to give way entirely to the character. Interviews became performances. Private parties were described as extensions of the shows. Alcohol, drugs, distorted religious symbols, and violent behavior. Some close friends reported that the artist struggled to step out of character. It was as if the persona had stopped being an invention and had become his main identity. The creation had devoured the creator. Art or ritual. While fans debated whether it was all just metaphor, rumors grew about Manson's involvement in ritualistic practices outside the stage. Though there was never concrete proof, stories circulated about private gatherings where elements of occultism mixed with sex, drugs, and psychological manipulation. Could the artist be separated from the work? Or was what the audience saw on stage just the tip of an iceberg revealing something much darker in real life? The fact is, by building his career on controversy and shock, Marilyn Manson created a labyrinth where no one could be sure where performance began and truth ended. The public saw a villain, a prophet of darkness, a brilliant artist, or perhaps all of these at once. And when art and life blur to such a degree, the consequences can be devastating. Marilyn Manson's stage was not just a show. It was the reflection of something deeper. And soon, the world would discover that behind the grotesque makeup and theatrics lay real accusations of pain, abuse, and destruction. For decades, Marilyn Manson was seen as an artist who played with the limits of what was acceptable. Many believed his performances were nothing more than that, a horror spectacle meant to shock, but harmless outside the stage. That perception began to collapse in 2021, when actress Evan Rachel Wood, Manson's ex-girlfriend, broke her silence and made devastating revelations. Evan, known for her work in Westworld and a Golden Globe nominee, revealed that she had been the victim of psychological manipulation, physical abuse, and sexual assault during her relationship with the singer. In a public statement, she not only described Manson as a controlling and cruel man, but also claimed that he isolated her, terrorized her, and kept her in a constant state of fear. "He started grooming me as a teenager and horrifically abused me for years," she wrote on her social media. The revelation landed like a bombshell. Until then, Manson had been accused by religious groups and conservatives of corrupting the youth. But now the accusations were coming from within, from someone who had lived in his inner circle. The domino effect. After Evan Rachel Wood's testimony, other women began to come forward. Actresses, models, and ex-girlfriends shared similar stories. Captivity, with locked doors and constant surveillance. Death threats, where he allegedly said he could destroy their lives if they tried to escape. Domination rituals, blending sex, violence, and occult symbolism. And even claims that Manson demanded absolute control over his partners' bodies and minds. Among those who joined the accusations were model Ashley Morgan Smithline and actress Esme Bianco, known for her role in Game of Thrones. Esme stated that she was led to believe she would be participating in a music video, but instead was kept under abusive conditions, assaulted, and manipulated. The house as a prison. Accounts describe Manson's Hollywood mansion as a suffocating environment. Dark rooms, walls covered in black drapes, windows sealed shut. The place seemed more like a prison than a home. Some accusers mentioned being forced to stay locked in rooms for hours, with no freedom of movement, as if they were pawns in a twisted game. For the public, it was shocking to imagine that the artist who turned the stage into a profane ritual also recreated that atmosphere in his personal life. The question became unavoidable. Were the shows mere performance, or were they the projection of real behavior? The collapse of an image. The allegations quickly had consequences. Record labels cut ties. Agents and managers distanced themselves. TV shows and films in which Manson appeared canceled his participation. The singer's career, built over decades of controversy and dark glamour, began to crumble at an accelerated pace. The public was divided. Many loyal fans insisted it was nothing more than an attack on artistic freedom, claiming Manson had always been a target because of his satanic image. Others, however, saw in the testimonies an undeniable pattern of abuse that could no longer be ignored. The character revealed. What once seemed like a theatrical game began to take on a new interpretation. The performances of domination, violence, and dark symbolism were no longer viewed merely as artistic metaphors, but as reflections of behavior that spilled into real life. For many critics, the great revelation was not only about Marilyn Manson, but about how much the industry had tolerated, or even celebrated, such behavior under the excuse of art. The accusations made it clear that there was a price behind the spectacle. Lives scarred by pain, trauma, and destruction. And so, the shock icon who had always prided himself on being society's perfect villain began to face his most feared role. That of a man exposed, not by myth, but by the voices that finally chose to break their silence. From the very beginning of his career, Marilyn Manson cultivated an aesthetic that not only challenged religion but profaned it. Inverted crucifixes, satanic references, images of blood and sacrifice were constant in his albums, music videos, and performances. To the public, this seemed like nothing more than a shock spectacle. But according to reports, there was something that went beyond the stage. Attraction to the occult. Manson openly declared his admiration for Aleister Crowley, the English magician once called the wickedest man in the world, and quoted passages from the Satanism of Anton LaVey. It was no secret that he enjoyed collecting desecrated religious objects, such as broken crucifixes, statues of saints smeared with red paint, and even burned Bibles. In interviews, he spoke about the psychological power of the occult, claiming that inverted religious symbols were tools of liberation. But behind-the-scenes accounts suggested that this fascination wasn't merely aesthetic. At private parties, black candles, pentagram drawings, and staged ceremonies resembling actual rituals were said to be present. Parties or black masses. Ex-girlfriends and witnesses described gatherings at Manson's house that seemed to go far beyond any notion of an ordinary party. The atmosphere was dark, the windows covered, the air heavy with incense. On certain occasions, he allegedly demanded that guests participate in ritualistic performances where sex, drugs, and symbolic violence mixed together. Some reports describe domination practices bordering on sadism, with Manson playing the role of a dark priest. Some believed it was nothing more than a private performance, but for many of the women who accused him, these rituals were the facade of real abuse, wrapped in occult symbolism to intensify fear and control. The border between art and life. Critics point out that Manson always used occultism as a marketing tool, a way to provoke conservative American society. But the fact that his own home became the stage for macabre reenactments raises a disturbing question. Had the persona become reality? Evan Rachel would even mention that Manson used occult symbols to create an atmosphere of psychological terror, making her believe she was part of something larger than just an abusive relationship. Other women reported being forced to take part in rituals of submission that went beyond the consensual, reinforcing the idea that this was not simply a fetish game but something deeply destructive. The myth sustained. With or without concrete proof, Manson's fascination with the occult was always fuel for rumors. For his fans, that aura of mystery and danger was part of the attraction. For his critics, it was evidence that the artist flirted with dark forces, whether real or symbolic. Manson rarely denied it. On the contrary, he often fed the doubt. In interviews, he made cryptic statements such as, "If I am or am not the villain you say, it doesn't matter. What matters is that you believe I am." This ambiguous posture only reinforced the myth. Was he merely a performance artist, or a man immersed in practices that crossed the line of acceptability? The impact on his legacy. The abuse allegations naturally intertwined with the stories of dark rituals, forming a narrative that was difficult to separate. For many, what once was just satanic theater began to be seen as a reflection of real behaviors. The artist who always played with fear and provocation was now trapped in the very labyrinth he had created. And as Marilyn Manson's public image crumbled, a new perception emerged. Perhaps the symbols he displayed for decades were not merely theatrical, but clues to a life marked by excess, abuse, and a genuine fascination with the darkest side of human nature. The myth of the Antichrist Superstar seemed, at last, to reveal that behind the grotesque makeup there was not just an artist, but a man who had turned his life into a kind of permanent ritual, and who dragged others into it. For decades, Marilyn Manson walked a fine line between fascination and revulsion. His career was built on provocation. The more he shocked, the more attention he received. But in 2021, the balance finally began to tip toward reality, and the mask of the Antichrist Superstar started to crack. The spark was Evan Rachel Wood's testimony, detailing years of physical, sexual, and psychological abuse. The account not only reached the public but also shook the industry that had protected him for so long. Record labels distanced themselves, agents severed contracts, and audiovisual productions canceled his participation. What had once been an iconic and feared artist became a man under investigation, the target of legal proceedings and intense public scrutiny. The fall was swift. Manson ceased to be the embodiment of cultural shock and became the portrait of a legacy stained with pain and controversy. Decline in the media. The media, which for years had celebrated him for his audacity and grotesque style, began to turn its gaze. Reports detailed not only the allegations but also behind-the-scenes accounts. Dark parties, domination rituals, and abusive behavior in relationships. The narrative that once turned him into a myth now portrayed him as a flawed, dangerous, and manipulative man. Loyal fans tried to defend the idol, claiming media persecution and artistic censorship. But the accumulation of testimonies, accounts, and allegations built a story that was difficult to ignore. Every old scandal, every rumor about dark rituals, every abuse claim seemed to fit into a pattern of behavior that could no longer be romanticized. The price of the persona. What makes Marilyn Manson's fall so ironic is that it seems to be a direct consequence of his own creation. For years, he cultivated a persona that flirted with violence, sadomasochism, and occult symbolism. But what worked as performative art became a lens exposing unacceptable behavior. The stage that once protected him now reflected his darkest side in raw and undeniable form. At the same time, former collaborators and associates began to break their silence, revealing stories that corroborated the victims' accounts. Some mentioned psychological manipulation and the exploitation of younger artists. Others spoke of an atmosphere of fear and submission inside Manson's home, which some described as a quasi-religious ritual environment, but deeply oppressive. The icon in ruins. For fans and the general public, the image of the iconic artist began to crumble. The aura of rebellion and creative genius surrounding him gave way to the perception of someone who abused his power and influence to dominate, control, and harm others. The line between myth and man became impossible to ignore. The impact was global. International media covered every development in the allegations, and discussions about consent, abuse, and power within the music industry intensified. Marilyn Manson, once a symbol of shock, had become a warning. A reminder of how fame and charisma can conceal deeply harmful behavior. Final reflection. Marilyn Manson's fall was not only personal, it was cultural. It exposed failures in the industry, patterns of abusive behavior, and the dangerous mix of talent, persona, and manipulation. The man who captivated and terrified crowds discovered that no stage can hide the truth indefinitely. In the end, the icon who claimed to be indestructible proved vulnerable. The Antichrist Superstar was unmasked, not by a conservative public or sensationalist media, but by the voices that had remained silent for years. Courageous women who decided to break the cycle of fear. Marilyn Manson still exists as an artist, but his legacy has been irrevocably tarnished. The combination of talent, provocation, and darkness that made him famous was also responsible for his fall. The lesson is clear. When art becomes entangled with abuse, the myth does not survive, and the truth finally prevails. After decades of controversy, performance, and scandal, the inevitable question remains: who is Marilyn Manson really? To the public, he was always a carefully constructed villain, a shock icon, a force that challenged moralities and institutions. To those who were close, he was a manipulator, someone who blended charm and violence, light and shadow, talent and destruction. The truth is that Brian Hugh Warner, the man behind the grotesque makeup, always knew how to use the character as a shield. Marilyn Manson allowed him to explore dark fantasies without limits while hiding his vulnerabilities and human flaws. But a shield, when worn for so long, becomes a prison. The persona consumes the individual, and the man dissolves into the myth. The ambiguous legacy. Artistically, Manson was revolutionary. He challenged norms, questioned religious and social dogmas, and redefined the aesthetic of industrial rock. His albums, music videos, and performances influenced generations, inspiring artists to explore the grotesque, the transgressive, and the dark. Yet this artistic genius cannot be separated from the abuse and manipulation allegations that emerged throughout his life. The contrast between talent and destruction is disturbing. For every fan who celebrates his art, there is a voice recounting trauma. The artist who took the stage as a cultural villain also used his charisma and power to exert control and violence. The line between myth and reality, always thin, was completely shattered. The persona that became reality. For years, Manson played with the idea of the occult, rituals, and horror. But hearing the voices of his victims makes it clear that many of these performances may have been projections of real behavior. The theater became reality, and what was supposed to be a spectacle was perceived as abuse and manipulation. The allegations from Evan Rachel Wood, Esme Bianco, Ashley Morgan Smith-Line, and other women not only shook the singer's career but also revealed how the combination of charisma, power, and a dark persona can become devastating when there are no boundaries. Reflection on the human shadow. Marilyn Manson is a study in extremes. Talent and transgression, charm and cruelty, art and abuse. The makeup, bizarre clothing, and grotesque performances were only the surface. Behind it was a man capable of creating imaginary worlds, but also of harming real people. What remains from this story is a reflection on cultural icons. They can inspire, challenge, and transform, but they can also carry dark secrets that only surface when mechanisms of power and fame collapse. Manson built his empire on shock and darkness. But in the end, it was not the media, nor conservative society, nor the scandal itself that unmasked him. It was the voices of those who suffered and chose to break their silence. The man and the myth. Today, Marilyn Manson remains an artist, but his story is no longer just about music or scandal. It is about power, manipulation, fascination with the occult, and the consequences of confusing persona with reality. The Antichrist Superstar is both myth and warning. And when the makeup comes off, when the stage is empty, only the man remains. Someone who shined in public, terrified crowds, but also left deep scars on those around him. Behind the persona, the truth is clear. Fame and talent cannot erase the pain caused. Marilyn Manson is, above all, a reflection of human complexity. Capable of creating beauty and horror, seducing and destroying, enchanting and harming. The character survives, but the man is finally seen in all his ambiguity. And thus ends the portrait of the shock icon, the artist who became a myth, and the man who, behind the mask, revealed a dark side no one should ignore.